like to introduce all of them to you. I'm going to start with my far right. The far right person there is Professor Thomas Zaitoff. Professor Zaitoff is an assistant professor in the School of Public Affairs at the American University. He received his PhD in politics from New York University in 2013, and previously a postdoctoral fellow at the prestigious Princeton University. His research examines why individuals participate in political violence, why groups fight, and the political and psychological effects of exposure to violence. As part of his research, he has conducted extensive field work and survey research in Israel, Mexico, and most recently, Turkey. To my right, still, is Professor Steve Taylor. Steve Taylor's teaching and research focus on urban politics, the politics of race and ethnicity, civil rights and liberties, and the political culture both in the United States and in West Africa. His published works include the book, Desegregation in Boston and Buffalo, The Influence of Local Leaders. Taylor has been awarded fellowships by the Ford Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation, an educator who is also involved in his local community. He serves on the Montgomery County, Maryland Human Rights Commission and the Transit Advisory Group for Montgomery County Department of Public Works and Transportation. To my immediate right is Professor Kathy Schneider. She writes and teaches on social movements, collective violence, policing, criminal justice, immigration, and racial and ethnic discrimination in Europe, the United States, and in Latin America. Her publications include the books, Police, Power, Race, and Riots, Urban Unrest in Paris and New York, and Shantytown Protest in Pinochet's Chile. She has many articles to her name, such as Violence and State Repression, Debating the Arab Spring, Police Power and Race Riots in Paris, Violence, Identity, and Spaces of Contention in Argentina, Chile, and Colombia. And finally, Framing Puerto Rican Identity. Ron Hampton is not here with us yet, so I move to my far left. I'm not describing her political affiliation. Professor Barron, a lawyer and social scientist. Professor Barron received her master's degree from the Department of Justice, Law, and Society at the American University. Thank you. Good. Her PhD studies focus on criminology and sociology of law. Professor Barron's research interests focus on gender, death penalty, and the role of law in society. That is, what should the law be, and what should it do to ensure a just society? Those are the panelists. Now, before we go further, I'd like to set the rules. I'm going to ask each one of the panelists to spend approximately 5 to 7 minutes discussing that issue concerning race, law, and society in Ferguson that they see most important. Each of our presenters will do this. Then we're going to open it up for questions among the presenters in terms of clarification, enhancement of the particular thought that they had, etc. Finally, then, we'll open it up to you, our audience, to ask questions, to give comments, etc. There are a couple ground rules. This is one of them. We're going to be talking about a very sensitive subject. We must respect everyone's values and everyone's beliefs. I retain the right to cut off discussion if it gets to the point where we are not respecting the rights of our fellow people within this auditorium. All right? Everyone agreed? Excellent. Tom, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me. So I'm going to talk very briefly about sort of 3 separate, but I think interrelated issues. So the first thing is I spent 5 years of my young adult life in St. Louis. I went to Washington University in St. Louis. And one of the things that's kind of immediately clear when you're in St. Louis is how much of the city it is divided. So St. Louis kind of has this interesting political geography. So the city limits themselves were set in 1915. In fact, a very small proportion of the total city metropolitan area actually lives within the city limits. There's in fact over 90 different municipalities in St. Louis County. And one of the other things that you notice when you're in St. Louis is that it's very hard when you want to drive through different neighborhoods. There are these concrete roadblocks, and it's kind of curious, and they were put in place in the 1980s by a mayor, and these are called Schemmelpots, and they're basically these concrete obstructions that prevent you from driving through neighborhoods. So one of the things that we know and we see in St. Louis is that there's over these 90 different municipalities. There's also over almost 90 different mayors. In these small municipalities, some of them number no more than 1,000. And so one of the things we might ask is why? And race is, a lot of people would argue, one of the central reasons for why. So these municipalities serve as a way, I would argue, for different communities within St. Louis to continue to basically serve the people that they want and not serve the other people that they don't want. And in St. Louis, the traditional sort of political fault line is between blacks and whites. So the center city is mostly black, and north of Del Mar, it's over 90% black, and immediately on the other side, it's over 70% white. Most of the western part of St. Louis is white upper class, whereas the city center, again, is much poorer. And in fact, when they opened the metro station to actually provide public transportation out to the western parts of the county, there was a big hullabaloo because they were like, well, we're letting poorer people out to the areas, there's going to be an increase in crime. And this was all code, I would argue, for race. So now kind of turning to this idea of division, I'm going to step outside of St. Louis itself and talk a little bit about a poll. CBS and New York Times conducted a poll in August 19th through the 20th, asking several questions about the Ferguson riots. So one of them was the shooting justified? Was the shooting was not justified? In fact, 18% of whites disagreed with that question, but over 57% of blacks agreed that it was not justified. Another question they asked is, have the protests gone too far? So 67% of whites said yes, only 43% of blacks said yes. Had the police gone too far? 27% of whites agreed with that, and over 50% of blacks agreed with that. So the same event is interpreted very differently depending upon people's ethnic identity. And then finally, I want to step out and talk a little bit about sort of the larger picture. So I think a key thing that when we're talking about policing, and something that gets obscured in St. Louis and sort of more generally, is one of the big factors that happened is that crime and violence generally has dropped dramatically since it peaked in the early 90s. So in St. Louis, in fact, which is traditionally one of the higher crime cities, crime has dropped by 30% since 2009. And there are a lot of arguments for why this might be. If you're Stephen Levitt and an economist, you might think it's abortion, the legalization of abortion. Other people would argue that it's better maternal health, reduction in lead. And I think, though, the kind of common theme that a lot of criminologists or economists would point to would say that it's one, better policing, and two, stiffer prison sentences. And so I think the kind of key question is, these trade-offs, right? These stiffer prison sentences and kind of tougher and smarter policing tactics have negative externalities. They have downsides to them. And the question that I would ask is, what trade-offs are people willing to make, right? Are we willing to let perhaps a higher rise in crime in order to perhaps increase our regard for other people's civil liberties? So that's it.
Thank you, Tom. Steve?
Okay, and thank all of you for being here. As a political scientist, I'm going to look at this political situation in Ferguson. As is very well reported, Ferguson has a population that's reflected in the 2010 census of being 67% black. However, that's not reflected in the elected officials. The mayor is a white Republican. Of the 6 members on the city council, only 1 person is black. Of the 7 members on the school board, none of them are black. 1 identifies as Hispanic, but none are black. And that contrasts with the school district. Like, say, there are 3 academic high schools in Ferguson. 1 is 68% black, 1 is 87% black, and 1 is 94% black. The all-white school board just fired the first black superintendent, who was fairly popular. Now, why is this situation existing? One is that Ferguson has what is referred to maybe 100 years ago would have been referred to as a reform political structure. Some of there were reforms that were placed in a lot of municipalities and counties implemented back in the early 20th century. And the reason was because they wanted to restrict the political power of immigrants and impoverished people. And as a result, if those reforms are still in place in a municipality or county, they have the effect of restricting the political power of racial minorities. For instance, Mayor James Knowles III, he's run under nonpartisan designation because that's one of the reforms in the city, is that there's no partisanship listed on the ballots. And what the history of that reform is that so that a person who is a Republican, back in the days when a lot of the immigrants voted Democratic, Republican would not be hobbled in trying to get support among the immigrants. And the same thing happens today when you're dealing with blacks, who are pretty much the backbone of the Democratic Party in some of these metropolitan areas. But even though the mayor does not run with partisan designation, he is very much a Republican and former head of the state's Young Republicans. And this is the same mayor also who denies that there are racial tensions in Ferguson. So either that mayor was in a coma, or that mayor was drinking a whole lot of scotch, because it was obvious to probably a baby that there was racial tension in Ferguson. Another thing that is the way the city council is configured. There are 6 members of the city council, all of them are white, and it's because they have dual member districts. Each district has 2 representatives, and of course, a lot of it has to do with how the districts are drawn up. But if they had 6 single member districts, you'd probably have at least 2 other blacks on the city council, but they have dual member districts instead of single member districts. The school board, as I said, was all white, all 7 members. They operate on this reform structure because all of them are elected at large. And that's one of the most significant ways in increasing minority participation on legislative bodies is by going to a district-based representation. That means more than even the percentage black, but they don't have district-based representation. And another thing is Ferguson district also, the school district doesn't just include Ferguson, but neighboring towns of Florissant and Berkeley. So the district itself is only 27% black, but the school district is overwhelmingly black, so apparently many of the whites don't send their children to public schools, not in the same, you don't utilize it at the same level that blacks do. Now another reason why we have this situation, there's a low turnout. When they had the last mayoral election, there was just 12% of the eligible voters came to vote. And the mayor was elected with under 50% vote. One of the things that keeps the turnout low is another one of these reforms. They have the elections in April. Some people say that's a good thing, and it makes so the elections aren't tainted by what happens on the national congressional level, but also brings fewer people to the polls. When the elections are held in November, more people come to the polls because there are more offices up for election. Another thing is that though the black population is in the majority, the fact is that it's a newer population. In 1990, only 24% of the residents of Ferguson were black. By the 2000 census, it was 52, and by the 2010 census, it was up to 67%. Certainly this reflects an overwhelming black majority, 2-to-1, but it also reflects the fact that blacks have been, our shorter term residents have not lived in Ferguson as long as whites have lived there. So therefore, whites have closer ties to the city and are more likely to be involved in the political system. And the disparity in usage of public schools, that blacks make much more use of public schools than whites, shows that there's a much higher percentage. One of the reasons is of minors in the black community, minors who are not yet eligible to vote. Now, we do have a Democratic district attorney in St. Louis County, McCulloch, but he's not one who's got a lot of support from the black community, particularly right now. People are concerned about him prosecuting the case. He comes from a police family. His father was a police officer. There's a Democratic governor who tried to help the situation in his way by sending state highway patrol persons to patrol the streets. And though McCulloch is a fellow Democrat, he strongly criticized Governor Nixon. He refused to prosecute police in the 2000 police shooting, where there was an excessive number of bullets in the eyes of the community fired into a car. where the victims were unarmed. And then, more recently, he refused to endorse the incumbent black county executive, who was actually the first black person that had that position. He refused to endorse him for re-election, and he lost the Democratic nomination. So I don't think the black community expects much from this particular Democrat, and they expect even less from the mayor and from the city council. So that's the political situation we're at today, where the black community feels absolutely powerless, and the reason why they feel that way is because they are.
Thank you, Steve. Kathy?
All right. So I understand that I'm not allowed to contest questions of other speakers again.
No,
but
give your presentation first, and then what we're going to do is we're going
All
to
right.
mix it up among the
Okay.
panel.
So, so let me just say that almost all riots, whether in the United States, Western Europe, have been the result of deadly confrontations between police officers and residents of poor minority neighborhoods, and that in almost every single case, it has been a situation in which the local power structure is white, the police force is white, and the minority community have few or no avenues of redress. This is especially the case after the killings of unarmed minority youth that are usually just the last straw on a situation of increasing police violence and police impunity. In the United States today, the reason we do not have more riots is simply because a number of community groups emerged out of the riots of the 60s, and many of these cities were funding young people from riot-prone neighborhoods as peacekeepers using Great Society programs. And out of these organizations and out of these young activists emerged an array of groups that are entirely focused on fighting police violence. Their success in reducing police violence has not been great, but what they have done is institutionalize the response to police violence, so that in the United States today, in most cases, what happens is that the community groups act as intermediaries. They help the families. They help the families explore options. They put pressure. Many have developed relationships with district attorneys or congresspeople, or they put pressure on district attorneys through mass marches, sit-ins, civil disobedience. They put pressure on federal governments to intervene to protect the civil rights of those who are killed. And they help families find lawyers. And cities have become proficient at demobilizing despite spending millions of dollars a year settling civil suits out of court. So community groups help families get lawyers, and cities, New York spent in the 90s $25 million a year to settle brutality complaints out of court. What Ferguson has done is reveal this ongoing problem. The reason it has become such a flashpoint is because it's a case where the community has responded to an issue that otherwise is invisible. But it is no less painful and no less problematic because it is invisible. And so what you are seeing in city after city, in poor minority neighborhoods, is communities feeling attacked by their own police force. That a police force that is supposed to be there to protect them, that in communities that are most vulnerable, most in need of protection, most likely to be victims of crime, the police act like an occupying army. What Ferguson did, because Ferguson is a newer community, because it doesn't have these well-developed community groups, because the power structure is so obstructive and not even allowing any form of redress, we have had something that harkens back to what had been a common phenomenon in the 60s and still occurs in Anaheim a couple of years ago, LA mostly in '92, on rare exceptions when there are No other avenues of redress or all of those paths to justice appear blocked.
Shana?
Okay. So what does law have to do with all of this? We live in a society here in America where we believe that law can fix everything. You have the right laws, they can fix things. But in many ways, we have to accept the fact that law is merely symbolic. It expresses our underlying values and what we believe is right, more than anything else. We pass laws, and the Supreme Court has expressed opinions that discrimination based on race is wrong. Yet we know that racism still exists in the society that we live in. What happened in Ferguson is, at least in part, an example of all of this. While the law is designed to treat all people equally, and race is considered an extra legal characteristic, that is, one that should have no impact whatsoever on legal outcomes, because race is so ingrained in American culture, it infects the legal process and legal decision-making implicitly, if not explicitly. In a legal sense, racial discrimination isn't intentional, as it once was. It's explicitly been eliminated from our laws. Nonetheless, it still has an impact on what happens. Much as we would like to believe it, we do not live in a post-racial world. At this moment, the law and the legal process are not directly relevant to what's happening and what has happened in Ferguson. The underlying cultural attitudes, though, toward race will play a part in what will happen and how it will happen when and if charges are brought against those people who are involved. Individual and societal attitudes and the experiences that we have will affect the way that jurors evaluate the evidence. They will affect how each of us view what happens in the courtroom and how it comes out. They will affect how the media portray those proceedings and interpret them for us, the public. This will have an impact on the legal outcome, as well as how that impact affects our views of society, law, and law enforcement. Each of the areas discussed by my fellow panelists clearly demonstrate the interconnectedness of all of these issues with one another and with the law. While legal formalists view law as a closed system, one that's affected only by the law itself, law exists as part of our entire social milieu. It cannot and it does not operate in a vacuum. Despite the highest values that we expect the law to embody, particularly its embrace of equal treatment and its rejection of discrimination, we must recognize that this is a goal that we strive for, not one that we have reached. Nor can the passage of legislation and court decisions alone achieve this impact. Those values must be enshrined in our hearts and our minds, as well as in the laws that we pass and the processes we use to enforce them. It is to the future where we will see the law play out. Once indictments are handed down, once the legal process comes into play, we'll see how the law affects what happened in Ferguson and how we view it.
Thank you, Shana. Do any of our panelists like to react to other panelists' presentations?
I do.
Okay, it's yours.
There certainly is no evidence that higher incarceration rates lead to bigger drops in crime. In fact, what most people have always talked about was that the largest drop in crime was in New York, which had among the lowest incarceration rates in the country, while Texas, which had among the highest, had growing crime. And in fact, if you look across the country, states with high incarceration rates had low crime drops or had growth in crime. So there's no connection between incarceration rates and crime. The issue about policing is also a mixed bag. So they tried to replicate, since William Bratton and Giuliani traveled around the world advising people to do zero tolerance policing, and they weren't really able to replicate those findings elsewhere, including something that conservative attorney Edwin Meese pointed out, who also pointed out about the complete mismatch between incarceration rates and drops in crime. And third, those communities that are most likely to be victims of crime are the ones who do not support mass incarceration or the violent policing of poor communities. What police reformers talk about and effective police forces have done is work with communities, and they argue that good policing is driven by trust with the community, with good information, and people willing to work with the police, not by attacking community members who are far more likely to be victims of crime than criminals.
Okay, can I respond?
Of course, please.
Well, thank you for that eloquent response and disagreement. A few things. One is, I was not suggesting that why crime has dropped is a closed case. I don't think. These are things that people posit as possible reasons. The incarceration rate in which you're talking about is actually, I think you don't give it full credit. It's actually much trickier to disentangle incarceration rates because we want to look at a lot of things are correlated with incarceration rates across states that may affect incarceration rates but may not have nothing to do with crime. So I just think it's trickier to disentangle that, and Levitt and others who have done some of the studies would argue that that's one factor. We don't know how much or how much or if not at all, because I would argue that there's a fair amount of evidence that incarceration rates do have an effect, whether it's what's the kind of larger effect of them on drops in crime rate, that's for other people to decide. In terms of the aggressive policing tactics, I agree with you, right? There's actually very weak evidence for stop and frisk working, and it's, again, it's very hard to disentangle what's actually going on. But I think there have been, at Temple University, they did a randomized experiment, and what they found is that it's just the presence of police officers. It's not stopping and frisking, the presence of foot patrols. So I would agree with you that it's not, going in military style, right, and throwing people up against the wall. That's not the answer, and that's not what I was arguing. I was saying, though, and what I do think, we have to think about is there are trade-offs that we as society can make. And I think one of the issues is, and I think one of the things that Ferguson kind of shows, and Steve talked a little bit about that, is that a lot of times the people that maybe are politically active, voting or electing these council members, right, if they're not the people that are affected by some of the bad stuff that comes along with these policies, then that won't change, right? So if people in the suburbs are voting for harsher harsher police tactics, and they're not the ones that actually are being affected by it, then we're not going to see kind of change. That's how I would argue. I'm not in favor of this. I'm just saying that there are trade-offs that are made, and it depends sort of on where you sit with people's views on that. That's all.
I'd like to address something that Kathy was saying about the task of interacting with the community. And one of the things that we found that we see happening in policing today is this change from a view that the police are public servants who are there to serve the community, and the attitude that the community is the enemy of the police and they have to protect themselves. And that undermines all of the ability for the community to get along with those law enforcement officers, and allows for the kinds of things that happened in Ferguson to continue throughout the country.
So Bernard Kerik, who was Giuliani's last police commissioner, and if you remember, he was recommended to be head of Homeland Security, and then they found that he was, taking kickbacks from mobsters, and he went to jail. And he's now this huge reformer, and he gave Matt Lauer a nickel and said, you know that most people in prison are in for that much drugs? And so I would say of anything that has had a negative impact on crime, that has just cut off people's absolute possibilities of moving back into the world and getting jobs and getting education, has been mass incarceration. DiGilio, who was one of the biggest supporters of tough on crime, has become the biggest reformer. And I keep saying, if they said in the 1970s that a conservative was a liberal who got mugged, that really what we have to talk about today is a liberal is a conservative who's gone to jail, because prison is not doing anything at all to reduce crime. I find that with 2.3 million people in jail, more than any country in the history of the universe, that it's strange to me that you would still say that it's questionable whether mass incarceration is responsible for the drops in crime. I don't know any of the major criminologists saying that now.
Can I just respond real quickly? I'm not saying, you keep, I think, implying that I think it's a good thing. I say it's a possible reason, and I'm not saying it's a good thing. I think there are a lot of negative things that come about with it, and it's not an optimal thing. But I do think, that when people deal or talk about, why crime declined, that is one reason, and I think, I think there is statistical evidence, and I would counter that says that, yeah, there's pretty good statistical evidence on it. I'm not saying, though, that that's something that we should think about. I think most people think that we have costs and benefits that we have to trade off, and the cost of incarcerating people, both from a moral standpoint, from a societal standpoint, and just from a pure economic standpoint, is really, really, really high. But that, I think, that's just something we have to consider when we're talking about reforming criminal justice.
I
Can I say
think we're missing
Go ahead,
something.
Steve,
Go ahead,
you
Steve.
take the floor.
One thing, when there was this talk about this drastic drop in the crime rate in New York because of Mayor Giuliani's aggressive tactics, first of all, there were one of the things that was brought up is that the drop in the crime rate had begun before he was mayor. But one thing is that comparison often has been made between another city not too far from New York where you saw an even more drastic drop, and that was in Boston. And under Mayor Menino, of course, he took credit, and they didn't have this increase in aggressive police tactics. What they had was implementation of community policing. Now, I don't know that that was the cause of the drop either. But of course, if I were Mayor Menino, I'd do like he did and say, yes, I'm the cause of it. Vote for me for re-election. And apparently it worked because no mayor served longer than he did as mayor of Boston. But this was the comparison made, where you don't have these tactics, yet you have a much more significant drop in the crime rate in the city. So that's one of the things that we saw. But I think some of the studies to find out if aggressive policing and increased sentencing leads to a drop in crime rate. I think what a lot of the researchers are missing, they're missing the boat. Because what they have to do is look at the people who are most vulnerable in committing crimes, and those are previous offenders. Interview them and find out, is the presence of long sentences a deterrent for them to become recidivists? And I haven't seen any of that research, and I don't think people really want to find out, because it might get, the null hypothesis might not be disproven. So that's one thing. Now, and I agree with what Kathy said, that there's not evidence that the longer sentences, the harsher punishments lead to a reduction in crime, but I don't think the public cares. It's just like, for instance, if you punch me in the eye and I get a black eye, there's nothing I can do, even a state isn't going to get rid of it right away. But if I punch you back, I'm going to feel better. No, not really, I wouldn't. Don't confuse me with some people in the NFL, but what I'm saying is it makes people feel good. But it still hasn't done anything to this black eye. It's still going to be swollen. I think that's what the public looks at, these rates, it's a good way to just punch back. And it doesn't work, but it makes me feel good.
I think we're missing something, okay? And I think the question is not whether or not crime is increasing or decreasing, but whether or not, what the connection is between race and crime in our minds as a society, how we view this connection between the two. We tend to think of crime in many ways in terms of race. And that's the concern here, not whether crime is going up or crime is going down, and why crime is going up or why crime is going down. That's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about this confluence between race, crime, and law in our society. And I think the discussion is missing that point, and I'd like to get us back on track.
Thank you, Shauna.
Go ahead.
Sure. The reason that in all polls, whites think differently about policing than blacks think about policing is because police behave differently in white neighborhoods than they do in black neighborhoods. When they're in white neighborhoods, they understand that their job is to protect residents, to serve residents, to protect residents' civil rights, and white community feels safer when they see a police officer. In poor Black and Latino communities who need to feel safe, who would like to have somebody in there protecting them, they see a police officer and they're afraid, and with good reason, because police officers behave differently towards poor minorities and in poor minority neighborhoods than they do in white neighborhoods. And Ron Hampton's not here, but Ron Hampton was also interviewed in my book, and what Ron Hampton likes to say is the only thing we're asking is that police behave the same way in poor Black and Latino communities that they do in middle class and wealthy white communities.
Well, one thing that I remember years ago in Boston when Francis Michael Roach, or we call him Mickey Roach, was the police commissioner, and he looked to be somebody who was trying to reach out to the black community more than previous police commissioners had. And I was at a forum, he came to a men's breakfast at a church one Sunday, and he said the problem that he sees is that the police officers come into the black community and they think that the public doesn't care about crime, isn't concerned about crime. That's one of the things, is they feel that their white public is concerned about crime, but the black community isn't, which is total hogwash. What he's saying is true, but it's hogwash that we don't care about crime because in some communities, the black communities have a higher rate of victimization by crime committed by residents and committed by the police.
I just wanted to ask a question more generally to the panel. So, something that we talked about was Ron Johnson and the fact that he kind of became the de facto spokesperson, and a lot of people cheered him on and said that this was a great thing, and I think it was. He stepped up to the plate in a very difficult situation. But I wonder is, the fact that he's having to step up and become the kind of community spokesperson, police point person. To me, this kind of gets at the point that I think we all are making is that this is, that says that there's a big problem in professionalization. If you have to bring in somebody from outside the community, outside the actual police department, to be able to have any, credential, and that's, I think, goes to your point, Kathy.
Yeah. So the city I thought you were going to say was not Boston, but New Haven, because I did extensive interviews with the former police chief of New Haven in the 1990s, where the crime rate dropped as much or more than in New York. And Nick Pastor used to say, it all starts at the top. It starts at what police are being asked to do, what they're being rewarded for doing, and what they're being held accountable for doing. And so he says, it's all nice to change recruiting methods, which he did, and people like to talk about how if you walk down the streets in New Haven in the time, there would be big posters, and it would say, are you gay? Did you march in Stonewall? We want you in the police. or it would say, you know, were you a Black Panther? Were you involved in school lunch programs? We want you in the police. But he said the recruiting was not the big thing. The big thing was changing the system of structure of incentives and rewards. And what he did was he gave rewards for police working with communities to solve problems. And that meant to recognize that many, in a very poor community, many families had a child that they were tearing their hair out because they wanted help to make sure the child stayed in school or whatever issue it was, but that if the police came in, breaking down their doors, throwing the kid to jail for 25 years, they'd lose their public housing, police would be viewed as an enemy, and the police would not like working there. In fact, police officers all told me about how they felt working in a neighborhood where everybody hated them. And that, on the contrary, if you worked with the community, solved those problems, the community would basically have the police officers back. Police officers wouldn't have to march into communities feeling afraid because, you know, good policing was driven by trust with the community, and violent police complaints were taken very seriously, and more than one was desk duty. And many of the cases, I talked to many family members whose kids were killed by police, and many of those cases, Francis Lavati, who killed Anthony Baez, 12 complaints against him, 9 for excessive use of force. His chief had recommended him be sent out of the police department. A judge had recommended desk duty, and his new chief, appointed by Giuliani, promoted him and put him out on the street. Yeah.
So I would like us to focus a little bit more on the facts of Ferguson and put it in the factual context. Why was,
So people behind you can hear you.
right, exactly. So why do you think that there was the kind of violence that occurred in Ferguson in the aftermath and not in New Haven and not in other cities? What do you think specifically occurred in Ferguson that created this violence?
What specifically happened in Ferguson is that the community, the response of the local power structure, the mayor and the police chief, to an incident of an grievously wounded community by the situation of somebody who had not only been killed unarmed, that witnesses said had their hands up, but it was left 4 hours in the street. Their response to the community's concerns, the community coming out, was to call at the police in full military gear, shoot rubber bullets into a crowd, tear gas with infants and toddlers in the crowd. It was a military response to a community that had just been egregiously wounded.
I can summarize in one word why you saw it happen in Ferguson. That one word is August. It was a time of the year when there were more likely to be crowds that could be victimized by the police, as some of the crowds were. People are more likely to come outside when the weather is pleasant and you're going to have larger crowds. That's only a part of it, but you know, I'm not just blaming the weather, but I'm saying that when there are more people outside, the police get a little bit more worried about the crowd, and the police are more likely to overreact when there's a large crowd. And there's going to be a large crowd, much larger crowd in August than there's going to be in March.
Yeah, but the previous month, NYPD killed Eric Garner for no reason, and it was still summer. There are things that cause the anger, and there are things that are ways in which local power holders of police or community groups can kind of calm the community.
And I think, in all fairness to what you said, I think if you have elected officials from the community to talk to the people and channel their grievances in a different way, then they're going to do so. But you don't have any elected officials in Ferguson to do so. And so in the presence of elected officials is evidence to the people that going to the polls is one way to see some redress. But there's no evidence there in that community.
On the contrary,
So-
the mayor said my police do nothing wrong.
We have a question back here, please.
So I'm hearing a lot about community policing and militarization of the police and how those things interact with the community. And a lot of research has shown that community policing shows a lot of promise for the future. But in a situation like Ferguson and in other similarly situated communities, community policing is really difficult to institute. And I think that's because of some of the issues we've pointed out of representation and also of, you're talking about like a white police force and white representation, overwhelmingly white representation in the government. So how can other similarly situated communities avoid similar incidents like Ferguson? How can they counteract this representation, and how can they encourage future community policing? And I think that there's a question of race in that matter in and of itself.
I think part of the answer to that is police culture more than who's on a particular police force. What's the culture of policing in a particular area? We know, for example, that there is an attitude against community policing, despite the evidence that we have that community policing makes a difference, that many police departments reject the notion of community policing or play to it only as far as is necessary to satisfy the community. So we have to talk about how we change the culture of policing in this country, and not whether or not is the police force representative of the community that it's serving.
Another thing, and this is what you alluded to in Ferguson, the disparity in representation between the community and the police force, and this can't be changed overnight. It can be changed though. But in the meantime, what the police force can do, though they can't be representative of the community because all the sun lamps in the world won't change that. But what they can do is reach out to the existing community organizations that have some legitimacy in the eyes of the community. Go to their meetings, meet with them, and get them to work and cooperate with the police when there are situations where the police need the community cooperation. That's one of the things I just talked about earlier about Mickey Roach was trying to do in Boston. I think he could have done a better job, but this is what you saw, is that he as the chief and other members, high-ranking members of the police department and not so high-ranking members, going out to these communities and going to their meetings, even some of the meetings that had nothing to do with crime. You saw Commissioner Roach there. So this is what they need to do, because by meeting with members of the community, it might dispel some of the policemen's negative and very incorrect assumptions about the black community.
All right, so I had a different take on this. So first of all, I don't think riots are the problem. In fact, if it wasn't for Ferguson having riots, we wouldn't be talking about police violence. Police violence is the problem. Whether a community explodes or not, it's a problem. And that has to be addressed, and thank God people are finally talking about it. By the way, from what I understand, one of the mothers who I interviewed in New York, who was blind, and the police killed her child, she won $10.5 million because he was taking care of her. She was out in Ferguson. Her son was killed by the NYPD. She said she was terrified of Ferguson. She says, you cannot imagine what the police were like out there. They were pushing her. She was blind. Somebody said, can't you see she's blind? I don't remember what they said that was nasty. So they're a scary police force. But for me, the problem is what we're asking police to do. Police don't do that if they're being held accountable. They're not being held accountable because white communities like when police behave that way in poor minority communities. And until we hold police accountable for that, then vulnerable communities have no way of responding. And the fact that they can get community groups to get federal courts and trials, listen, all of these people, so many of the families I interviewed, they won millions of dollars from the city. That was not what they wanted. they took that money and they created new organizations to fight police brutality. What they wanted was the end of police violence. And Kadiatou Diallo told me, and Iris Baez told me, and every single one told me they thought the amount of publicity of their case meant that their child would be the last one to be killed by police. And it wasn't.
One last, I guess, comment is that I think that the other thing too that'll be kind of in the long run will be interesting to see in Ferguson is there's now a push to get higher turnout at municipal elections. There's also been talk about trying to, because I think at a fundamental level we can talk about community policing, but until you kind of have electoral accountability for mayors and when you have single-digit turnouts and non-representative turnouts, right, you're not going to rectify this problem. So there's been also talk about figuring out a way to take St. Louis's crazy municipalities and realign them, and I think that would help because then you wouldn't have this problem, if you have just this small little fiefdom versus kind of a broader representation.
And I agree with what you're saying, Tom,
Yeah.
but the problem is that those who go to the polls are people who feel that they benefited from the political system. And it's very difficult to get people who feel they've been victimized by the system to participate in voting. And I agree that they do need to vote, but it's very difficult to convince people like that.
Yeah. Do you have an answer to that? Happy to hear it.
I don't.
Yeah.
We have a question back here.
Hi, first of all, I'd like to thank you all for taking your time to be part of this panel. My question is, it seems that, that's where I'm sitting. It seems that one of the biggest problems is police militarization, and what you mentioned earlier was a paradigm shift from the police being civic servants and trying to help out the community to seeing the community as the enemy. And it seems to be something that even goes beyond race. As someone who participated in the Occupy protests, I'm from Oakland, where Scott Olson, who is a white military veteran, was, severely injured. So my question is two parts. When did this paradigm shift happen, and what, as a citizen, can I do to try to redress that and change it back to where the police actually are protecting the communities that I live in and just protect the civilians in general?
I'm not sure if it's been a completely, dramatic paradigm shift because police always abuse minority communities in this country. That has a long, long history, and again, most of the riots in the 1960s were police killings in minority neighborhoods in mostly northern and western cities. That being said, things on criminal justice did have a tremendous shift towards a much more punitive model, starting with Ronald Reagan's election victory on a campaign that was a very thinly coded, racially, racist campaign, demonizing poor people under terms like welfare queens and poverty pimps and drug fiends and wars on drugs and wars on crime. And once you're talking about domestic populations and issues of poverty as a war, then it doesn't go it's not very far before you start arming your police as if they're fighting a war and treating them like they should be engaged in military warfare.
I would say that the paradigm shift happened earlier, and the paradigm shift was when there was a push for more humane policing. That was the paradigm shift. And then what happened during the 1980s was a return to normalcy. Because I think what happened in the 60s, particularly with the publicity of the civil rights movement, people saw police violence at its worst, and there was some strong element of the public that wanted to say, maybe we should stop this. But then by the 80s, it was a return to normalcy, back to business as usual. Go get them. Sick them, please.
Actually, that's right. Somebody just wrote to me who was one of Mayor Lindsay's advisors and was on the Kerner Commission and said exactly that Lindsay and the Kerner Commission really pushed for a different way of doing policing.
And it's only getting worse now that we're selling military equipment to the police departments. have to.
Sorry, the second part of the question is, what can we do about it?
That's for your generation.
That's not an answer, Shannon.
Can I say another problem for voters? I mean, to a large extent, you know, it's getting different people elected. But there's been a big problem of people getting candidates elected who then do exactly the opposite of what they campaigned on. Certainly New Yorkers are feeling that way already about Bill de Blasio, who campaigned on police reform and brings back William Bratton. You know, it's really discouraging when you get people out, and I think that was a lot of your generation. That's my own theory about Occupy, because I remember 2008 when young people were out and put all their heart into the Obama campaign. And I think when you put your heart into campaigns and the elected officials don't look that different from the campaign that you were campaigning against, it's discouraging. And there's a couple political scientists at Princeton who've just shown that politicians in America, there's little relationship between what voters want and what they do. Huge.
If you're rich, though.
No, a huge relationship between money and what they do, right?
Yeah.
They know exactly what donors want, and that's what they do. What voters want doesn't seem to matter much anymore.
I think one thing that you can do, and people in your generation have more energy to do it, is unconventional political behavior. Protests, demonstrations, peaceful, but being very visible and very loud and noticeable. This attracts attention, not just domestic attention, it attracts international attention. And the United States is very concerned about its image abroad because we are a world power. Some might say we're the world power. So bringing a lot of this attention, it's just like the demonstrators said in August of 1968 in Chicago. They kept on chanting, the world is watching, the world is watching, the world is watching. And the world is still watching. Bring attention to the world about what happens here in the United States.
We have a question down here.
Yes, my name is Elijah Staggers. I'm a first-year master's student in the Justice Law and Criminology Department. My question is with respect to excessive force complaints against police officers. Now, most African-American men would argue that they aren't granted their constitutionally endowed rights to, presumption of innocence when deciding if there's probable cause to arrest, charge, or indict them on criminal matters. However, data tells us that most of the complaints of excessive force against police officers result in either no convictions or, at the very least, they enjoy biased processes whereby they are tried by other policemen in which they're presumed innocent until there's overwhelming evidence to suggest otherwise. So my question to the panelists is, what do you think of this disparity between the criminal procedure, the criminal process that African American men have to endure, or really any minority for that matter, and the trial by which police officers are investigated for excessive force? And if there is a disparity between these two, how do you suggest that we fix it?
Okay. In terms of the reason it's so hard to convict police officers is because you're dependent on the district attorney to indict and present a case, and district attorneys rely on police to pursue other cases. There's a very close relationship between district attorneys and police. And so they aren't the best ways to get justice in terms of police officers. But what the late William Stuntz argues in his really magnificent book, I would recommend The Collapse of American Justice, is that police institutions have to be held responsible. So in New York, for instance, if you win a civil suit against the city, taxpayers pay the family. So Juanita Young got $10.5 million. The police didn't pay any of that. The police officers didn't pay any of that. The city paid it out. Police officers are, scot-free. We have to hold police institutions culpable for the actions of their officers. And I think that may, that is one avenue of pursuing. And again, the problem is having political will.
Whereas I can't address as to how to change things, I'm not sure. But let's look at the situation in Ferguson, whereas as we know very well that 67% of the residents are black. But as far as those who are stopped by the police, 86% of those who are stopped by the police are black. Now, does this mean that they're guilty? Only, of the white people who were stopped, 34% of them had contraband, so they should have been stopped. Only 34%. Blacks, it was down to 22%. So a lot of them are just stopped. Blacks are much more likely to be stopped for no reason than whites are. And Ferguson is just a replica of what happens throughout the country, because I know I've been stopped, and the most dangerous thing that I had in my pocket were my keys to my house. But but I've been stopped on my way to work here and coming home from work here, because I had the temerity to ride my bicycle through a predominantly white neighborhood.
As one thing to follow up, so one of the solutions that people have talked about is this kind of hotspot policing that, that basically instead of taking it out of the officer's hands as to where they patrol and where they stop, but instead giving them actually like a computer algorithm crunches the data. The problem with that is based off of past arrest records, a lot of it, and it ends up looking, when you get down to it, who are the people that they're stopping? It's exactly the same. It's predominantly African American, Black, minority communities. So I think, my suggestion, and I think, and it's the toughest suggestion, is institutional reform. I mean, that's what has to happen, but that's also politically the most difficult. So it's kind of it's a depressing story, I think, a little bit.
There are two problems. One is the fact that a lot of these complaints are heard through police review boards making their own determinations. There's been a lot of controversy over whether or not there should be civilian review boards, and it raises all kinds of political issues. But once we go outside that system, the law is such that it makes it difficult to make a complaint because police officers are working under color of law. And unless the conduct is really egregious, to get a prosecutor to bring a case when the law says as long as they are working under color of law, they are immune from prosecution, it makes it that much more difficult.
In addition, the test is subjective. If the force is unreasonable, the test is subjective in their own subjective perception. And there we are in the problem of personal racial prejudice.
Do you feel like the role of technology will make any difference in?
We need a microphone up there. We can't hear you.
Is there a microphone around?
Yeah, Dick's got it.
Hi. I was wondering what you guys thought the role that technology would play, especially for Ferguson, like even if people could see the photos and the video of what was going on there, why there was such a national outcry. And then going on from that, what role will technology have, like even if we could see the shooting and hear the audio of like Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin, what difference does it make?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of community groups have relied on these film and cop watch. They're beaten up all the time because they follow police around and they film things. And so we do get to see what happened. And the problem is, even when we see it, it doesn't do anything. I mean, that's my own theory about the 1992 riots in LA. The whole country saw what happened. And that didn't make it any difference to an all-white jury. And so that is a frustrating aspect. It's a good thing to take those pictures, but I'm not, we have to change the way in which this country views the policing of minorities. They would just not tolerate it in their own communities. And by the way, it's not just the United States, because my book's also about France. This is also about Europe. And in fact, the reason I wrote about riots was because in Europe, riots are still frequent response to police violence. And what happened every time there was a riot was all of these politicians and social scientists would trot out all these theories, underclass culture, pogroms, hypermasculinity, anything but the obvious. Because if their child was killed by police and the police had left them to die and the president of the country or, you know, the head of the police had said, my police did nothing wrong, there's no need for an investigation, you bet they'd be out in the street. So there's just an injustice in how this, you know, we look at the death of an unarmed youth, when that unarmed youth is poor and minority versus middle class and white. And that is why videotape doesn't seem to have the impact it should.
Think about the statistics that Steve gave before about the perceptions of what happened and how we can all see the same thing and perceive it so differently. We all share those same values, oh my God, this is terrible, but then we see it through the color of our own experiences, and maybe it doesn't look so terrible.
I remember a case in 1977 in Buffalo, New York. There was a case where it was a white middle-class youngster, I think his name was Richard Long, was driving, and some off-duty police officers probably had been drinking a little bit too much, and they were chasing him. He didn't know they were cops because they weren't in uniform, and they pulled him over and they stomped him to death. And there was such an outcry from the community because it was in a middle-class neighborhood. But see, this is a rare. They don't do this in those neighborhoods. If Richard Long had been a black person, the white communities would, what did he do? Whereas instead they were saying, they weren't even thinking of what he did. They stomped him to death? What a way to go. This is terrible. See, and so there's that perception. That's the same thing. Like with when Rodney King was beaten on television, and it was easy to get an acquittal because if you just choose your venue for your jury, and the jury's going to look at it and saying, well, they're going to put Rodney King on trial.
It's on PC.
So if the public keeps looking at it, what did this victim do? Then you're not going to get much difference.
Can I, just to address kind of, I think your original point, you were talking about technology, and this is a big, I mean, New Jersey is starting to, whether it will actually get passed, they passed a law basically mandating dash cams and talking about instituting.
They are too.
Yeah, I mean, and this is also, and what's interesting too is this is also a good thing, prosecutors don't like this, but it's a good thing because it's going to basically force them, they're going to have to, whenever there's a case, it's going to be on the burden of them to say there is evidence of this being recorded. Now, I don't know if it's going to change juries' minds, but maybe the other thing we haven't thought about is that will it give a hesitancy to police behavior? And that I think actually holds maybe more promise than swaying people. It's going to, if you're being monitored, perhaps you're going to maybe be a little more judicious before you do something you probably shouldn't. So.
There was a study like that in Rialto, California, when they put the cameras, and they found that use of force dropped by 60%, complaints against police dropped by 80%. It was a big impact. But then there was another community in New Mexico that didn't find that. So,
So a question back here, somebody's been waiting for a long time.
Hi. Okay, so on the topic of social media and crime, what would you guys say about, so like whenever you hear news reporters broadcast an arrest, they always say male, black male, Hispanic male. They always like mention the race. And I was curious as to something like, this wouldn't directly address police violence accountability, but it could be a way our generation fixes our stigma against high minority crime, is instead of listing the race of the arrested person, why don't they just say like male arrested for this crime, and maybe there will be less stigma from the people, the American people, to judge that, oh, it's just another minority making trouble. And so maybe that could help the stigma of high minority crime in the US. What would you guys say to that?
You brought up something that's interesting because a lot of conservatives talk about a colorblind society and ignoring race. But then when it comes to looking at crime, the colorblindness is over. So, of course, with all political ideologies are inconsistent and self-centered. But you're absolutely right. And I think what's contingent upon those of us from the black community which I think would help, and it's not going to be a quick solution, it's going to be a long-term solution that'll take generations. More of us, like Charles Barkley said, get your damn education. That means get into these institutions of higher education so that the people who are going to be the decision makers in the future interact with us and see that we don't grow horns or have tails, that we're people just like everybody else who want to make it ahead in life. But if the numbers are so low, people aren't interacting with them, and then they can maintain their stereotypes. But if more of us do, like Barkley said, I don't agree with much else he said, but I'll agree with that. If more of us do this and get into school and be in these situations where we're meeting with people who are future CEOs, future police officers, future mayors, future governors, and they have to interact with us in the dormitory, in the classroom, and if more of us become professors and become, then the students interact with us as professors, they'll see us in a professional capacity, then they'll have a different attitude toward us. And I see, contrary to what people say, there's a much larger percentage, and statistics bear this out, of African Americans in college in your generation than there were in my generation. So the numbers are increasing, but not quickly enough. So encourage those of us who are black, stay in school, go further on, and encourage our children, our cousins, our friends to do the same thing. And I'm not saying if you don't go to school you're not a good person. Of course, a lot of people, but this is where you interact with the people who are going to be the decision makers of tomorrow.
Just to chime in, I think it's a noble idea, but I don't think like sweeping race or ethnicity under the carpet is going to change things. I mean, I think, yeah, I don't think it's going to change perception. In some sense, I think we need to focus on it more, because then it forces people to kind of acknowledge actually what's going on in here.
But I feel like, as Professor Taylor had mentioned, if like less people heard that black males or Mexican males are being arrested for a crime, then the stigma against them would be lessened a little bit, and they could progress better in society.
That's
I feel like
a
they're
social thing, though, right? Society's arresting them. I don't think it's the fact that we're reporting on it. It's the underlying fact why we're arresting them at higher rates that matters more than whether we report on it. But that's a fair point.
Thank you.
We have a question here.
Hi. Actually, mine is just more of a comment. I just wanted to comment on what this lady said about technology and cameras. When I think about the cameras, I still feel like they're still going to try to find a way to absolve the cop. When you look at situations like what happened in Oakland a few years ago with Oscar Grant, even though the cop wasn't wearing a camera, someone else caught the video on camera, and Oscar Grant the film showed the cop shooting Oscar Grant while he was laying face down on his stomach. And I think what they tried to say was, if I remember correctly, that the cop was reaching for his taser, or he thought the gun was his taser. And I think the outcome of the trial is he got involuntary manslaughter, and I think he got like 2 years or something like that. But yeah, I just wanted to comment. I don't think cameras will do much, unfortunately.
I think it's an open question, right? I mean, in fact, the National Institute of Justice and a lot of other research organizations are kind of looking into what is the effect of technology and there is also a big brother aspect of it. I mean, are we going to end up, putting cameras in every, minority or high-risk crime community and record everything that goes on there? That has some interesting kind of implications. I mean, so I don't know, I think it's to be determined, and I think, it may help, but I mean, it's still, you have to address kind of the root cause of the violence and the institutional problems with policing. I think that's a fair point that you made.
And the issue is, not everybody is going to be willing not only a small number of people are willing to record what they see as police violence. So if they see the police acting in a situation where they perceive to be violent, and they have the capability of recording it, they don't want to be next. So So I think when we see these incidents on camera, that's just the tip of the iceberg. And you're not going to get to the base of that iceberg because it takes a lot of bravery for somebody to turn in the police.
People, the cop watch follows them around in New York. They're always being beaten up. They're always ending up in jail and beaten up. But I did want to talk more about this issue about the portrayal of Black or Latino crime. And the problem is that most victims of crime are Black or Latino. And there's more victims of crime than criminals, because the criminals are a very tiny percentage of a population. And so why are we looking at crime and thinking, oh, it's Black criminal, white victim? That is not the nature of crime. It's people who live in poor neighborhoods are more likely to be victimized. They're more likely to, and they are the ones who actually are in most need of police protection. And police are not protecting them. They are not doing the things to make those communities that are most likely to be victimized by crime safer. They are treating potential crime victims, actual crime victims, as if they were criminals.
I was wondering if you guys could comment on the media coverage of it and whether or not the extreme media coverage will have an influence in their decision regarding whether the officer will get into trouble or be prosecuted or anything.
Technically, media coverage shouldn't have any impact on whether or not charges are brought. Whether or not they actually will is another question. It's more likely, in terms of media coverage, to think about it in terms of how it's going to affect a jury pool if indeed charges are ever brought. It's one of the big questions about our whole legal system. How much does media impact have on finding a jury of your peers that can evaluate the evidence apart from what they've seen and heard in the media? But it has very little impact on whether or not charges are actually going to be brought. That's much more within the legal system itself.
And prosecutors can use the prevalence of media coverage as an excuse to change the venue into an area where the police are very likely to be acquitted. For instance, St. Louis County, the jury pool is much different than in Branson, Missouri. And so that media coverage might be a pretext for moving for a change of venue.
It's more likely to be the defendant who's going to ask to move.
But,
if indeed...
but in Los Angeles, it wasn't.
No, the defendants were the police
was the
officers. It's the
defendants
police
that had
officers
moved
that
out
asked
of
it to
Los
be moved because...
One of the most heartbreaking things that I've read recently was an article entitled, "Let's Face It, Trayvon Martin Let You Down." And it was addressing the concerns that you guys have brought up about putting the victim on trial rather than actually dealing with what occurred. And so my question to you, I guess, is, as advocates for police reform, is it more effective to focus on the police force as an institution, or is it still more effective, even if we're putting these victims on trial, to use these examples specifically and to talk about what happened in Ferguson specifically, as opposed to maybe focusing on a broader form of advocacy?
I think we need to talk about a broader advocacy about police reform. I don't think we should get into debates on specific cases. There's not one case in Ferguson. There's many cases. There's many cases in every city. And so we have to talk about policing in a different way. Policing poor, vulnerable communities in a different way. And I think we do have to open up a conversation about policing. And, maybe if once we did do that, maybe it was a little moment in 1968, but we made a conversation again. I don't know what it will take to get this country to do that. Maybe it takes riots.
and you brought up the case Trayvon Martin, and I think if George Zimmerman had been a police officer in uniform, he might not have even been prosecuted in Seminole County, Florida, much less acquitted.
Hi, good evening. Thank you guys again for being here. It's been very interesting. I have a question about what did you think may happen post this investigation in Ferguson? For example, I have a great concern that the community is going to burn, literally, if this officer is not brought up on charges. And I'm just curious to know, what do you think that the police department, who the community does not trust, can do to kind of prevent something from happening if this officer is essentially not charged?
All right, so whether or not police officers are charged or whether or not they're convicted, how communities respond has everything to do with how fair the community think the process was. There is a real problem with the district attorney who not only had police officers in his family, his father was a police officer killed by an African-American male. There's a real feeling that this district attorney already has his mind made up. So is he really going to press for a serious indictment? There's skepticism. That being said, it's not clear over time whether the community responds again, because when you don't bring up charges, it has to be the day it brings up. I'm not afraid of community burning. I mean, I just think we have to have a conversation about police violence, and we only seem to have that when communities burn. Not that I think saying we should go out and riot these or destroy people's communities, and it's usually their own communities, but the real issue is, let's talk about police violence. You know, why are we talking about, why are we not talking about Eric Garner in New York? Was that a less egregious case? No. It just because there wasn't riots, there were mass protests, there were mass marches. I mean, there was a gorgeous march in Staten Island with, tens of thousands of people. It was really, but you don't get a response. So I would really like to say, what do we need to do to get this issue addressed and in a serious way?
And, the reason why I'm not worried about a community burning is it rarely happens. And I think that's just a stereotype people have, that, oh, these people are violent, it's a kettle about to explode. It's not. And it didn't happen when Amadou Diallo was killed and when his tormentors were acquitted. It didn't happen when Trayvon Martin was killed and the perpetrator was acquitted. It didn't happen when Garner was killed, strangled to death, choked to death. So even in Ferguson, it didn't really happen. They talk about the Ferguson riots. When you look at Detroit in 1967, Newark in 1967,
Washington, D.C.
in 1968, the riot, that's media exaggeration. And so I'm not worried. The community hasn't burned down yet, and I might be wrong, but much more often than not, it does not happen.
Yes.
We've had a lot of discussion about putting the victim on trial, but I'd just like a point of clarification. How would it be possible to determine whether the use of force was justified without putting the victim of the force on trial? Like, how would we then determine that?
All right, so what usually happens, you know that in most courts of law, you can't use previous convictions against a person, right? You investigate the actual case. What happened at that time? What has been trotted out is not about what happened at that moment, but claims about a history that turns out to have been mostly invented. So instead of talking about the situation at hand, they say, well, he had a long criminal record. Well, it turns out he didn't. But we have, history. So that is not relevant. It's just not relevant to the case. What happened at that moment? What do the eyewitnesses say? What does the coroner say? What is the evidence in terms of what exactly happened during that period of time?
See, and the problem is when victims are put on trial, after they're dead, they can't respond, which makes it really easy to put them on trial. But there was a case in New York where there was a case of police brutality, and it was an African American, and the mayor, Giuliani, said, well, he was no choir boy. Turned out he was, and he wasn't somebody with a criminal background. But I will say this: a defense attorney, if he knows he can get away with it and get an acquittal, they're going to do whatever they can, and it's up to a judge to determine that the trial is conducted properly, and that's another concern. Not just prosecutorial misconduct, but judicial misconduct. But if the judge is going to let them get away with it, and they can get an acquittal in a high-profile case, they can write their ticket. And that's what, people are in law to make money, and that's a good way to make a reputation for oneself.
Those are the things that we'll see once the criminal prosecution begins, if indeed it does, how it plays out.
Hello, I'm here just to say, reiterate again, thank you for so much coming down here and really discussing this really needed issue. I would like to apologize in advance if you've already addressed what I'm about to ask, because I was not here for the entirety of the discussion. But I wanted to know, because we continue to address that this issue needs to be talked about, it needs to be discussed. And I just wanted to know who exactly needs to be discussing this, where and what institutions do we need to bring this to? Does it need to be more legislative reform, more social reform? Does it need to start at the local grassroots level? Who can come together to really make an effective change for reform in our policing system?
Well, for one, you really want to put pressure on your local officials. So one of the difficulties of changing policing on the national level is that police answer to a mayor. And so having in your own city, writing letters to your mayor, to your local congresspeople, asking for meetings with them, the kinds of pressure you want to put on local officials to talk about how police are behaving in your community, what kinds of things you want the police to be doing, what kinds of police reform you'd like to see. And if you work for a campaign, work for a candidate who does that, target campaigns and candidates that, play on people's fears and talk about launching wars on crime or wars on drugs or wars on terror, talk about protecting, instead say we want to talk about protecting vulnerable communities, we want to talk about establishing trust and working with communities, we want police officers that serve that community. On the national level, it is more difficult for a host of reasons, but certainly at the local level, it's doable.
One thing that I would suggest is that you do, write. Send letters to newspapers, letters to the editors, letters to magazines. And before you write those letters, do your research. Make sure that it's backed up with factual information, not just opinion, not just lies. But that's the advantage of getting an education, that you learn how to do that kind of research. Put your education to work. Yep. First, get your education and put it to work and put these things in writing. Let the public see what the true story is.
Yeah. One thing that I'd like to add is I think part of what's kind of tough about getting these reforms through is some of them, bureaucratic politics, if you ever take that class, is far and away like the most boring class you will take. But it's where a lot of the nitty gritty happens. So one of the issues in St. Louis is you have multiple overlapping jurisdictions, and it becomes very difficult to hold different departments accountable. So fixing some of these bureaucratic politics, I think, is important, and kind of understanding that, a lot of these rules that may seem inane, like in St. Louis, the fact that the actual city limit is super small, right? That seems like a very small, kind of inconsequential thing, but that's a huge thing, right? Because that's where the city, and then you have the county police, and then you have the Ferguson police. And I remember when there was, a fight on the Loop, and you have 3 different police departments responding to that. And that creates problems, that creates infighting, and I think, when we talk about sort of, grassroots stuff, it also has to be addressing these things that, may seem innocuous, like the fact that there are 3 different police departments overlapping, but in fact, I think are critical.
Thank you.
We have a question in the back.
Hi. So, one of the things that's always kind of been sitting in the back of my mind is, while discussions of militarization of the police force and kind of all of these social situations that are coming out of Ferguson is incredibly important, one of the things that always seems to be kind of drowned out in the den of kind of this chaos is the whole thing began because of a questionable shoot. So I guess my question to kind of you guys, or question to anybody in this room would be, how do we tease out and make questionable shoots less questionable, whether or not they were justified or not? Or how do we reshape formal and informal law to actually give clear advice rather than kind of the subjective perception of events?
So I would quibble, I think, with your, maybe stronger than quibble, I would strongly disagree, is that I don't think the problem, I mean, I think the questionable shoot, or whatever you want to call what happened, where an innocent, an unarmed person gets shot, right? That's, the kind of spark, but there's all this other stuff, the kindling that was there beforehand, the inequalities, the non-representation. I think I would argue maybe that's my bias as a political scientist, but those kind of structural social issues, the fact that the police are more likely to stop blacks than whites in Ferguson by a wide margin, that's the bigger issue in the kind of long run that has to be addressed.
I would also say, I would say that the ways in which police bias operates has to do with structural inequality. And without structural inequality, you don't have policing differentials. You don't have police violence, which is almost always used only against poors and minorities, anywhere, anybody who's studied police violence. And from a white perspective, it may look like a questionable shoot. But if you're living in a community where family members, yourself, has been subjected to violence, and where the killing of unarmed people is all too common. Now, in many of the cases that I looked at, like Eric Garner, one of the most common ways of police killings are illegal chokeholds. It's not a questionable shoot, it's an illegal chokehold. It's illegal for a reason. Police still use it. They used it in July against Eric Garner and they killed him. They used it against Anthony Bias because his football hit their car. They killed him. And so if your experience of the police is they come into your neighborhood and they kill the community, then you're not looking at the issue, is this a questionable shoot? It's within the context of a police force that is treating residents of a community as if they are an enemy army.
How do you think the aggression from society and minorities on police affects how police respond? And how do you think the media coverage of that aggression affects how police respond to these incidents? Like you hear like about Ferguson where police shoot an unarmed black teenager, but then you don't hear about the incident in Rochester last month where an African-American man was on parole after serving time in prison for armed robbery and then shoots a white police officer. So how do you think the difference in coverage and the situations affect how police respond back
Well, the reason why you don't hear about that type of thing about black civilians shooting police officers is because it doesn't happen very often, number one. And number two, it's very unlikely that that black civilian who was accused of shooting that police officer was on the payroll of the municipal payroll. The police officer was. That's what people hold municipal employees to a different standard. And that's why, because of the fact that they are paid by the public, and whereas criminals aren't paid by the public, they're preying on the public. So that's why, but I don't, what you're talking about, these incidents, that's not that they don't happen very often. And that's why you don't see the coverage. If it was something that happened as regularly, I'm sure you would see quite a bit of coverage.
Yeah, I have a slightly different take on it. So I'm sorry Ron Hampton didn't show up because he was one of the police officers who I've learned a great deal from, and I interviewed a lot of police. And what they all say is if you go into a poor neighborhood, actual predators make up 1%, 5% of the neighborhood. What makes police unsafe in such a neighborhood is that everybody hates them. If you establish trust with the community, if nonviolent people in that community don't see you as the enemy, then you're safer because they provide you with the kind of critical information you need to be safe. It's the police who have decided that an entire neighborhood should be tarred with the same brush, and therefore they are, entering enemy territory. And it does become a vicious circle. So they go in and they see the neighborhood as their enemy, and the neighborhood sees them as an enemy. So the neighborhood doesn't trust them. So they form these tight bonds with other officers, and therefore when their officers use violence, they don't report them because they say what makes our life, our job bearable is the solidarity we feel with other officers. And so the officers support officers, the neighbors support neighborhoods. What you have to do to have effective police that makes police officers safe and makes neighbors safe is a trust relationship established in which the police work with communities and they help. That's what problem-solving police, they call it now, because community policing is kind of amorphous. It's not, clear which community members. It means different things. But problem-solving means you work with the community. You do not target people for quality of life crimes, for carrying a joint, for drinking beer on your stoop, for painting graffiti. You work with the community and understand that community is, vulnerable to a host of issues by virtue of being poor, overworked, underpaid. And if you establish that relationship, then you are less likely to be victimized by those in the community who might want to attack a police officer.
Just one quick kind of follow-up is that, to kind of piggyback off of what Kathy was saying is that one thing we know from cross-national research on victimization during war or any kind of exposure to violence and crime, whether it be Mexico, the Middle East, etc., is that violence tends to harden people's attitudes. And, so one of the things that I think Kathy's talking about is the fact that maybe violence or even, kind of these aggressive policing tactics, even if we put aside whether they're effective in the short term, in the long run, right, you're basically, one is you have the officer who's involved in this aggressive action, so you're hardening their attitudes, and then you have the community that's receiving this, and you're hardening both of their attitudes, right? And in the long run, that's not good kind of for anybody. So.
I have a different take. I don't know that there's that there's a strong level of hostility that the African American community has toward the police. I know that there is a lot of fear. But when I was an undergrad, I was a criminal justice major, and a number of my colleagues were in-service police officers, and one who worked in the most heavily black precinct of his city. And he said to me, "You ask anybody on the force, we'd much rather work in a black community because we get a lot more respect than we would in a white middle-class community." And that might be true, but it also might be more fear, and fear. So that's why I don't think that police are necessarily physically unsafe in those communities, but because of the fear. But the problem is fear might make them safer physically, but it might make it more difficult for them to close cases because they're not getting the cooperation that's needed for good police work.
Fear and aggression, we know, go hand in hand.
Being treated disrespectfully is more likely to happen in a white community because police are more likely to stop whites when they're inebriated, and because whites are less likely to be frightened of police. So most of the studies of policing have found that the old theory that Black or minority youth were stopped more often because they were less respectful. They were actually found the reverse when they actually did observation. So the disrespect is certainly greater in a white community, but fear of police is does the same thing for the safety of officers as hatred of the police. That is, police do not have people to talk to. And if they don't have community members that are going to share information with them and tell them when there's something suspicious or tell them when there's something that they might be in danger, their work is less safe.
We have a question here.
Hi. Wow. Don't know my own power. My name is O'Neill Ormsby, and I work with the International Association of Chiefs of Police. And I had a question for you regarding, you know, I look at some other departments that maybe abuse police power and use resources inappropriately, and it casts a shadow on the other police departments that do use resources well. And how do you separate the two? In other words, I see almost like a big brush being cast over all law enforcement, whereas that's not necessarily the case. Just like you said, in a neighborhood that maybe you have 1% that's not maybe behaving appropriately, the other 99% are perfectly fine. Well, maybe you have most of the police departments, the vast majority, I would say, the United States are doing just fine. We have maybe a small percentage, and those are the ones that draw all the public attention. How do you separate the two?
One of the biggest problems, so, when you interview police, and this is, the Police Executive Research Forum found this also in focus groups with police, anytime you ask police about violent police, they say, there's a few bad apples in every barrel, right? It's always a bad apple. But the problem isn't the bad police officer. The problem is the other officers that cover for the police officer. It's the institution that covers for them. It's the police chief that covers for them. It's the fact that they're not held accountable. It's the impunity. Therefore, big communities are right in thinking, hey, if a police officer can come in and abuse us and nobody's going to stop him, we are victimized by the police. They have a right to generalize it to the police, because unless the police do their own enforcement of respectful behavior towards communities and sanction abuse of police officers, then it is generalized to the entire body and for a reason. Did I answer it or not? Did I not get it?
It sort of is.
I think one thing that, as I said earlier, I think that by more black students going to college and interacting with people is dispelling people's stereotypes. Likewise, when police forces prioritize taking them out of the car, putting them on the feet, walking down the street, getting to know people, the people will see police officers in a more positive light. And then when there are these bad incidents, they can counteract them with the times when that person helped them, gave them directions, just little things like that. Or when they saw that police officer come off duty and go into the club and play bid whist with them, just little things like that. And that's why I think community policing is a good, even if it might not bring down crime as much as Mayor Menino in Boston said it does, it certainly gives people a chance to interact with policemen in a more positive setting.
And just to give you an idea of what I'm trying to say is, I travel on occasion and I go abroad, and people have a certain impression of American abroad. America's so big and vast and broad, it's not necessarily an accurate representation. I had a cousin who came here from England, and she was very afraid because she thought that we all walked around with guns and it was like the Wild Wild West and we would shoot each other and say, look, that's... but I would say most Americans have never seen a shooting in their neighborhoods or anything. The closest we've come is seeing it on television. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think when incidents like this happen, it brings out, people see the worst in police work. But I think that sometimes that overshadows the larger degree of good and also the good departments. I talked with the church group that had wanting to know about what was happening in Ferguson and comparing it to Montgomery County. And the biggest challenge for me was to say, hey, look, let's talk about Ferguson, let's look at Montgomery County, and let's look at the differences and what have you. And I think they have the impression that Ferguson is Montgomery County. That's not the case. And I think that that's a challenge.
There's no question about that.
Well-
Most of the police in this country are fine, et cetera, and it's not even that there are a few bad apples. But we have to recognize that institutionally, in some communities, particularly in communities that are facing poverty and structural disadvantage, there are problems that occur between the police and the rest of the community, and we can't push it aside and not acknowledge it, but at the same time we should probably be acknowledging all those situations in which the police do fine work for the community and the world that we live in. And you're absolutely right.
I mean, one way that, think about it is that I think that it's a question, of professionalism, right? So is sort of having, and this goes to the idea about institutionals, the idea that one is whenever something happens, there is a procedure, it's always followed to a T, and at the end of the day that even people who may not agree with the outcome, this is the idea of procedural justice. They'll agree with the procedure that found it fair. And I think right now the issue is that a lot of people don't think that the procedures are fair, and I think, they would argue that the behavior in Ferguson, while may not representative of police officers all across, where was the professionalism that you have a military outfit for somewhat peaceful protests? I think that's the argument, is that, the professionalism is the way to maybe instill that.
There's another problem, which I noticed many places, New York, Paris, which is violent police officers are often punished by being put in the poorest, most vulnerable communities. And good police officers are often rewarded by being moved into the suburbs. So the communities that are most in need of good officers often end up with the worst officers. Yeah. And I know.
I mean, I was in Turkey this summer, and before they had huge, very large protests, and one of the things they did with the riot police there is they kept them in like a cold barracks, and they didn't feed them like that well the night before. I mean, you can argue whether that was politically strategic or not, but we know sort of what the outcome is going to be.
But, there are these, it really is police officers protecting each other that makes it generalized to the institution. Every single case I know of a police violence issue was at least initially a concocted story by the police. And often, in several cases, it was the one female police officer that turned, evidence at court on the trial and said, well, actually, we concocted that story when we were in the courtroom, when we were in the parking lot. That was the Anthony Bias case, the Nicholas Hayward case.
We have a question in the back.
Hi again. So, as a citizen, I actually really don't know what police officers go through in their training, but I was wondering, when they go out into the the more urban cities and with the more minority population, is it possible for them to go out there, maybe not in uniform, and then gain more trust and respect from the victims of police victims?
No, the funny thing that some of the worst violence is committed by police not in uniform. So uniforms not wearing uniforms is not what breeds trust. It's how you behave in the community.
In the early 1970s, the Knapp Commission in New York found their conclusion was that virtually all of the police officers not in uniform were involved in some sort of, maybe minor corruption. That's what their conclusion was.
Minor corruption. They say in the 1960s the two biggest heroin wholesalers in New York City was the Sheezy crime family and the New York Police Department.
That's what happens when you don't pay them well.
I mean, to feel, I think though, one thing that can be done is, I don't think saying that, acknowledging that all of a sudden, we're gonna figure out a way to reduce, people's prejudice that's been kind of instilled from them since birth. I don't think we're gonna be able to find a way to instantly reduce people's prejudice that's been instilled in them from birth and been reinforced from society, but I think there's a lot of tools. There's cognitive behavioral therapy. A lot of psychological studies show that it's effective. I think we just have to institute and tell people, hey, you come with biases, whether they're implicit or explicit, and these are how to recognize them, and these are strategies so that you can make sure that you're fair in dealing with other people. And I think that goes back to the idea of professionalism.
And do police go through that training as well, like psychological training, trying to minimize biases?
It varies from department to department.
The people I interviewed in the NYPD minority offices in NYPD said that they got the reverse. That they came into the police department, that they may not have had those prejudices, but that the training installed them, that they were told during training, when you get into this community, be very, careful. If they grab for this way, they're grabbing for a gun. Be on your lookout. That there was a lot of buildup of those. So we don't know that the action, I imagine it is true, depends on the police department.
So part of that, like police violence, is because of their training. Is that?
But I would say that police violence is because of their training, it's because of their orders, it's because of the hierarchy, it's because of what's being rewarded and what's being punished, what's being held accountable, what's the incentive structure. And it's about the political messages and what we're asking police to do.
And I'd say police violence is because society condones it, accepts it, and supports it.
Believe it or not, it's 9 o'clock. Thank you so very much for being such a very good and thoughtful audience. And panel, thank you for being such thoughtful people. I would like to tell you that we have another seminar coming up. It's on children as soldiers. Bill will be passing out flyers as you leave, October 1st. Please think about coming. It is a sensational subject, a tragic subject, something that we must address. Again, thank you for coming. You've been a wonderful audience.